and welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Jimmy Smith, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first album is called The Cat, released in 1964. This one was recorded during Smith's later years for Verve Records. Very intense and fast-paced material. Midnight Special was released in 1961. This album features a collaboration between two pioneers in music, Jimmy Smith and Stanley Turrentine. Smith was a pioneer of the use of the Hammond B3 organ and alternative to the piano in hard pop music. Turrentine was a legendary saxophonist who was steeped in blues and soul jazz. Most of the songs are blues and bop songs. And The Sermon, released in 1959. This was another great album from Smith's Blue Note recordings. Also, like the previous album, this album helped popularize the use of the Hammond B3 organ. It's got some of the best jazz artists of the era playing it. So that was a quick recap of what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We'll be right back after some music. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Jimmy Smith, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called The Cat, released in 1964. This one was recorded during Smith's later years for Verve Records. It's got a lot of atmosphere, and his famous B3 Hammond organ also makes an appearance. Also, a novelty in this album, the use of the organ in a big ensemble format, which was a new innovation at the time. Two of the tracks from the album, The Carpetbaggers and the title track, went on to be featured as movie soundtracks. The Cat was featured on several TV adverts, and The Carpetbaggers was used as a BBC theme song. Also, the band conductor was the famous orchestra conductor Lalo Schifrin, and his music sounds typically deep and cinematic. In some places, the songs are like soundtracks of thriller movies. Very intense and fast-paced material. Jimmy Smith is particularly great on St. Louis blues. On other songs, he's more relaxed and laid back. Bluesy songs like Chicago Serenade and Basin Street Blues, a great album from the jazz, soul and funk genre. Midnight Special was released in 1961. This one was indeed a special album, featuring a special collaboration between two pioneers in music, Jimmy Smith and Stanley Turrentine. Smith was a pioneer of the use of the Hammond B3 organ, an alternative to the piano in hard pop music. Turrentine was a legendary tenor saxophonist who was steeped in blues and soul jazz. So this was an iconic collaboration between the two maestros. They produced several great albums together, most famously Back at the Chicken Shack. This one's another. It's got the same lineup in both cases: Smith, Turrentine, guitarist Kenny Burrell and drummer Donald Bailey. The scene opens up with a beautiful blues piece, Midnight in Special. Turrentine sets a scene with a dynamic solo. Smith takes it up from there with a contrasting slow, sensuous turn. It's pure blues perfection. And then the pace quickens with the song Subtle One, a toe-tapping bop song. With Jumping the Blues, things get even more dynamic. This one's a rendition of a great rock and roll song. The song's reimagined as a hard bop and blues song. The song ends on a swinging note with a rendition of Count Basie's 1 O'Clock Jump. The Sermon was released in 1959. This was another great album from Smith's Blue Note recordings. Also, like the previous album, this album helped popularize the use of the Hammond B3 organ. This album features two separate sessions from 1957 and 58. The songs were recorded at the Manhattan Towers Hotel Ballroom. The album begins with the title track, a 20-minute long piece. It's one of the outstanding tracks of the album. It's got some of the best jazz artists of the era playing on it. There's Art Blakey's groovy drumming, Kenny Burrell on guitar, and his playing is flawless. There's also trumpet prodigy Lee Morgan. Tina Brooks is on saxophone, and she was one of the rising stars in the jazz scene at the time. Smith himself displays an ability beyond his years in his playing. His playing is very inventive and dynamic and ranges from blazing through hard bop tunes like Confirmation and Au Prévave to beautiful Charlie Parker compositions to gentle and nostalgic on ballads like Lover Man. One of the most inventive organists of the hard bop generation. He also does something different with this album. At the time, it was typical for three organs to perform simultaneously in a trio, and in this album he sometimes switches instruments, soloing for instance alongside Lee Morgan and Lou Donaldson. Another great album compilation of organ music and even soul music. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Jimmy Smith, his life and times and best hits. Now some trending concert news. Christian McBride is a multiple Grammy Award-winning artist and one of the best bass players in jazz. He's collaborated with other jazz legends like Wynton Marsalis, Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock and more, and produced a string of award-winning albums. He's always been on the move, touring and performing nationally and internationally. His band features saxophonist Nicole Glover, guitarist Ellie Pearlman, pianist Mike King and drummer Savannah Harris. He's just announced his next concert series. It's taking place in Albany, New York City on March 19th at 8 p.m. Tickets are now open for booking. For tickets, please visit tickets.theegg.org. So that was some trending concert news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Jimmy Smith's best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Jimmy Smith, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first album is called Groovin' at Small's Paradise Volume 1, released in 1958. This one's a very experimental album, also loud and dynamic. Jimmy is joined by a trio on this album: Smith's on organ, Eddie McFadden on guitar, and Donald Bailey on drums. There's many peppy, hard-paced bop tracks on the album. Organ Grinder Swing was released in 1965. Joining him on this album is Kenny Burrell and Grady Tate on guitar and drums. This one's a straight-ahead set of jazz songs. There's a wide range of music from the slow bluesy "Oh No Baby" to a rapid-paced rendition of Greensleeve that showcases his organ prowess. Bash, the unpredictable Jimmy Smith plays Fats Waller was released in 1956. This album was also a tribute to pianist Fats Waller and sees Jimmy Smith performing some of his best-loved classics alongside an orchestra comprising brass, saxophone and drums. And Jimmy and Wes the Dynamic Duo was released in 1966. This one's another great collaboration album between Jimmy Smith and guitar maestro Wes Montgomery. They synchronize beautifully, blending bop and blues themes. So that was a quick recap of what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Yashani Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Yashani Silva. On this week's episode, Jimmy Smith, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Groovin' at Small's Paradise Volume 1, released in 1958. Jimmy Smith became a sensation almost overnight. He was widely popular and also prolific when he burst onto the jazz scene in 1956. In just 3 years, he produced an amazing 23 albums. Many of his records were a testimonial to his incredible ability on the piano, innovative and groundbreaking. Grooving at Small's Paradise is one example. It's a very experimental album, also loud and dynamic. Jimmy Smith is basically playing magic tricks on his Hammond B3 organ. He's joined by a trio on the album: Smith on organ, Eddie McFadden on guitar, and Donald Bailey on drums. Also many peppy, hard-paced tracks here like The Champ and Walkin'. Smith is at his best, blazing away through hard bop tracks. There's also a great blues song called After Hours. Nearly all the songs begin with a keyboard solo. Guitarist McFadden, by contrast, is relaxed and laid back. He also has a spotlight on the song Indiana. Bailey is solid and rhythmic on drums. Another album called Organ Grinder Swing, released in 1956. So Jimmy Smith started out with Blue Note Records, where he broke records with his innovations. He would typically work in trio settings and his song repertoire was mainly bop music. There were also occasional guest appearances. After that he left for Verve Records, where he began performing alongside orchestral style ensembles. In the 1965 Organ Grinder Swing, we see him returning to his old days. Joining him on this album is Kenny Burrell and Grady Tate on guitar and drums. There's 3 blues pieces and 3 jazz classics. This one's a straight-ahead set of jazz songs. There's a wide range of music from the slow bluesy "Oh No Baby" to a rapid-paced rendition of Greensleeves that showcases his organ prowess. Burrell and Tate play very poetically and nostalgically. The unpredictable Jimmy Smith plays Fats Waller was released in 1956. This was another great album from Verve Records. During this time, Jimmy was playing very experimentally, experimenting with new ideas and themes in his music. He also increased his range from blues and bebop. This album was also a tribute to pianist Fats Waller and sees Jimmy Smith performing some of his best-loved classics alongside an orchestra comprising brass, saxophone and drums. The opening track, Walk in the Wild Side, went on to become one of Jimmy Smith's best classics. There's some great individual solos by Joe Newman on trumpet and Phil Woods on alto saxophone. The final 3 pieces see Smith returning to his original trio setting alongside guitarist Quentin Warren and drummer Donald Bailey on some swinging upbeat numbers. An album called Jimmy and Wes the Dynamic Duo, released in 1966. This was another great collaboration album between Jimmy Smith and guitar maestro Wes Montgomery. At the time, they were at the peak of their success, with several chart-topping hits to their credit. They synchronized beautifully, blending bop and blues themes. The flamboyance of Smith's playing on the Hammond B3 organ complements the mellow tastefulness of Montgomery's guitar lines very beautifully. There's some incredible solos on pieces like Down by the Riverside, Night Train and Death March. They are also backed by a 13-piece orchestra featuring musicians like saxophonist Phil Woods, trumpeter Clark Terry and others. There's also a beautiful track that Jimmy Smith composed for the occasion called Jimmy and Wes, featuring Grady Tate on drums and Ray Barreto on percussion. The album ends on a Christmassy note with a rendition of a much-loved Christmas classic, Baby It's Cold Outside. This song is typically performed as an instrumental duet, and Wes Montgomery's guitar and Smith's organ music begin with an interactive musical dialogue before branching out into solos. This album was one of Jimmy's best albums and peaked at the top of the charts upon release. So that was some insight into more of Jimmy Smith's best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Yashani Silva. On this week's episode, Jimmy Smith, his life and times and best hits. We've come to an end of this week's episode of the Jazz Update, so now it's time to recap what we were discussing during this program. Jimmy Smith was one of the leading jazz keyboardists of his time. By his early teens, he had become an expert keyboardist and had won several local talent contests. He started out with Blue Note Records, stealing the spotlight with amazing albums like The Champ and the incredible Jimmy Smith at Club Baby Grand. In 1963, he switched to Verve Records. His very first album for Verve Records, Bash, the unpredictable Jimmy Smith, became a massive success. In 1972, he started out solo, performing at local concerts in California. In the early 80s, he returned to the jazz scene on Milestone Records, producing more great albums. In 2004, Jimmy was awarded the Jazz Master Award by the National Endowment for the Arts. He died in 2008, leaving behind a legacy as one of the greatest organists in jazz. So that was some insight into his biography. Now let's talk about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called The Sermon, released in 1959. This one's a great album from Smith's Blue Note recordings. The album features two separate sessions from 1957 and 58. It's got some of the best jazz artists of the era playing it, like Art Blakey and Kenny Burrell. Smith's playing is very inventive and dynamic. Another album called Root Down, released in 1972. This is one of his most swinging albums. His playing is raw and energetic. This album features a combination of fast-paced and slow-paced songs. Jimmy and Wes the Dynamic Duo was released in 1966, another great collaboration album between Jimmy Smith and guitar legend Wes Montgomery. There's some incredible solos on pieces like Down by the Riverside, Night Train and Death March. And Groovin' at Small's Paradise Volume 1, released in 1958. This one's a very experimental album, also loud and dynamic. Jimmy is joined by a trio on the album, Smith on organ, Eddie McFadden on guitar and Donald Bailey on drums. There's many peppy, hard-paced bop tracks on the album. So that was a quick insight into everything that we discussed on this week's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. You can check out the archives of today's program on my YouTube channel, The Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan. So on that note, I'll see you again next week and wishing you a very happy new year ahead.